thank you very much to all for being with us for this roundtable this afternoon, which will close our first day of the conference. And very many thanks to our 4 speakers on this roundtable. We thought that, it would be, given the variety of perspective topics that are being brought together in the course of these 2 days, that it would be really enlightening to have a discussion bringing all 4 of you together. So what I'll do is I'll briefly introduce all 4 speakers at the start, in the order, in fact, not in which they appear on the programme, but in which they'll speak, which then means that we can keep the conversation going a bit more, let it flow a bit more than with introductions throughout. And the objective as well is to leave ourselves, a comfortable time for questions afterwards. So I'm really delighted to introduce Pauline Schnapper, who's Professor of British Politics at the Sorbonne Nouvelle, where she's also the Vice President for Research. She's published numerous articles and several books on British foreign policy, decision-making, identities in contemporary Britain, with a particular focus on the complicated relations between Britain or the United Kingdom and the European Union. Her first book was actually called Le Grand Malentendu, between Britain and Europe, which was published in 2000. And her latest, which was co-written with her colleague Emmanuel Avril in 2019, is on Brexit and the political choices for the UK in the aftermath of the referendum. And once again, a very apt title in French, Où va le Royaume-Uni? We also have with us Harshan Kumarasingham, who's Senior Lecturer in British Politics at the University of Edinburgh. His research encompasses law, constitutional history and politics in the long ends of empire, including the Westminster model and its exports across the world. Some of his more recent publications from 2020 include 2 edited books, one on the Crown as head of state in political crises in the post-war Commonwealth, and another on liberal ideals and the politics of decolonisation. Our third speaker this evening is Henning Melber, currently Senior Research Associate at the Nordic Africa Institute and Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. Henning has taught at several universities in Europe and Africa, and he's written extensively on Namibia, Southern Africa, more generally, issues of global governance, international civil society, racism, and the role of the United Nations. He's currently also the co-editor of the Africa Yearbook, and one of his latest publications is an edited volume in honour of Dieter Neuber, The World from the Perspective of the Development Sociologist, which was published in 2020. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague Peter Clegg, Associate Professor in Politics and Head of the Department of Health and Social Sciences at the University of the West of England in Bristol. His research focuses on Britain's overseas territories, He's recently co-edited a volume on Euro-Caribbean societies in the 21st century. And he's, I think, currently coordinating a special issue of the Roundtable Journal on Falkland Islands 40 years after the war with Kate Mason. And I believe that the call for papers, which is available on the journal's website, is still open until November. So I'm really pleased that we have our four colleagues with us to talk about more about what the Atlantic Charter means in contemporary politics, in contemporary British politics, but more generally global politics. And I suppose it was interesting in our discussions earlier on today that Virginie Roiron in one of the discussions was saying, well, everyone sort of talks and knows about the Atlantic Charter, but the contents aren't necessarily terribly well known, nor do people necessarily know all the ins and outs. And at the same time, it is it seems to be a founding moment, one that people know about, even if the details are perhaps more fuzzy. And so, Pauline, in particular, I was wondering sort of how you see this being played out in sort of contemporary British debates and discussions on perhaps Europe more particularly, and how you see the place of sovereignty in particular as having featured in cultural narratives of the British state and society.
Thank you very much, Mélanie. Thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you this morning, or indeed will be able to be with you tomorrow because of these stupid endless meetings that you referred to when you introduced me and who take too much of my time, I'm afraid. As you said, I'm not a historian, I'm a political scientist, and I'm interested in, among other things, in issues of discourse and more generally the political culture of Britain, especially in the context of European integration, as you mentioned, but also in the context of the Union states, which is where I, if I may, will also say a few words about self-determination in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and how does this play out with the discourses on sovereignty, which we hear a lot about at the moment. So my approach is a constructivist one from that point of view. Is to look at sovereignty not so much or not only as a concept, but also as a political construct, as a political tool, which has been central in the whole debate about Europe since the 50s and 60s. Among British political elites in general, I think, whether Conservative or Labour, there was this very widespread idea that the sovereignty was absolute. It was not something that you could share. It wasn't something that you could pool. You were either sovereign or not sovereign. Sovereignty in this sense was, of course, at least in theory, the sovereignty of Westminster, parliamentary sovereignty, not the sovereignty of the people or of the executive. But it was central in the Westminster model, and it was central in the contestation of European integration from the early 60s onwards. It was this idea that even though in practice, I would argue sovereignty was never absolute. I mean, the UK was always part of international agreements and agreed to, in practice, limited sovereignty. In the political discourse, there was no limit to the sovereignty of Parliament. And this, of course, goes back very, very far in history and Dicey, etc., which I'm not going talking about here. So from the start of the European project, sovereignty was seen as the main obstacle to the UK taking part in European integration. It was the sovereignty of Westminster was seen as incompatible with the supranational dimension of the EC and then EU. In contrast, and I'm being extremely simplistic here because of the limited time that I have, but in contrast with a widespread vision of across the continent, which saw sovereignty as something relative, something that you try to have, that you try to increase, but that you were very aware of limitations for all sorts of historical and institutional reasons. The experience of the continent as far as sovereignty is concerned was very different. And in particular, in the UK, I think, contrary to what happened in Germany or in France, there was no difference made between power and sovereignty. The idea that sovereignty in itself was not very important if you didn't have power was something that you didn't really hear in the British debates on European integration. The idea that sovereignty might in practice be limited if you didn't have the power to use it was not something very widespread. So the distinction between a de jure and de facto sovereignty, it was not something that you heard a lot. And again, this was not a left or right, left-wing or right-wing issue. It was what across the political spectrum. You could hear it with Gatesco in the early 60s. You could hear it, of course, with Enoch Powell, but also many others. And obviously, you heard a lot of contemporary echoes of this attitude towards sovereignty in the Brexit debate during the referendum campaign in 2016 and since. What is interesting here is that the sovereignty argument, the idea that laws should be made in Westminster, not in Brussels, that Brussels, the EU, had encroached upon British sovereignty, was not just used by the Leave campaigners, the Conservatives and UKIP, but was, surveys tell us, very successful with the electorate. It is really something that chimed with many Leave voters and partly explains the outcome of the referendum, even if, of course, there were other arguments which were extremely powerful as well, such as immigration to start with, border control, saving money, etc. But the sovereignty argument was very powerful, especially among, I would argue, the middle class vote, but not just middle class Leave vote. Now, if sovereignty has remained as powerful as an argument in the contemporary political debate, the second point that I would like to make is or question that I would like to ask is, how does this square with the idea of self-determination, in particular in the case of the British nations? This very limited, or at least absolute definition of sovereignty might well be difficult to reconcile with the idea of self-determination. And here I think there's also really a difference between pre-2016 and post-2016. My impression is that before 2016, the British state was quite successful at reconciling the idea of Westminster sovereignty with the idea of self-determination in Scotland, for example, but also in Northern Ireland, although it's a very specific case. But it did work. If you look at the devolution agreements, the acts of 1998, the Scotland Act, for instance, left Westminster as the ultimate arbiter of the Constitution and as keeping the sovereignty. So the devolution settlement was not, in theory, in contradiction, with the sovereignty of Westminster. Similarly, in 2014, Cameron, as Prime Minister, agreed to the organisation of a referendum on independence in Scotland. Similarly, although in a very different environment, the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland recognised the right of the two communities and the Northern Ireland population as a whole to decide its future if in a majority of the people in Northern Ireland became in favour of a change in the constitution. And so it left the possibility to the people of Northern Ireland to change, to decide their future and a possible change in the constitution, or at least a change in the status quo. And in both cases, it was a difficult balance which had been found and which was totally upset by the Brexit referendum. And my final point would be that I think it's now much more problematic to reconcile sovereignty and self-determination within the British state following the Brexit experience. What we see, and I won't develop here, of course, is tensions in Scotland and the prospect of possibly either a second referendum or a major crisis between the SNP government in Edinburgh and the central government in London. We see tensions, especially at the moment, over the Northern Ireland Protocol signed by the current government in its negotiations with the EU. And we see, and that's maybe a final paradox with which I will finish here, a centralization of power in the executive in London, which is not exactly what the Leave campaigners had argued in 2016 when they talked about taking back control and recovering sovereignty lost to Brussels. So we find ourselves with a possible major crisis coming and a conflict between these two legitimacies, if I may say, the sovereignty one on the one hand and the principle of self-determination on the other. All of this within the UK and supposedly United Kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pauline, for all of these thoughts. I'll turn directly to Harshan to think. Oh.
Sorry, did you want me to?
Oh, sorry. I got there was a anyway. I couldn't see your name at all, and I thought I had to sort of readmit you, so I got distracted. Sorry. Yes, no. Please, Harshan.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate. And sorry I couldn't be here for the beginning. And thank you also to Pauline for very good and excellent comments for me to build upon, perhaps. So if I understood what I was tasked to do, it was to look at how the Atlantic Charter had interest in many of the issues that Pauline brought up about sovereignty and self-determination, but in many parts of the colonial world during that time, especially, of course, the British Empire, and forgive me if you've already said this in earlier panels today, but I was looking at the Charter earlier and looked at especially Article 3 of the Charter, which linking to, again, Pauline's words, it explicitly says that they respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. And as you can imagine, this made great resonance across the colonial world, and especially the British Empire, which of course was largely still an empire rather than a Commonwealth. And interestingly, on the very day of the announcement of the Charter, which I note is the 15th of August, which is 6 years later, is the date that India becomes independent, though few at the time would have guessed that would have been the span of time, let alone the date. But on that very day, Sir Reginald Dorman Smith, who was the governor of Burma, sent a telegram to Leo Amery, who was the Secretary of State for India and Burma, and he explicitly asked the Cabinet and the Secretary of State whether this formulation about sovereign rights and the ability to have self-government for those who have had them forcibly deprived of them, Dorman Smith asked, was this to be taken here to apply literally to Burma? So on the very day of the announcement of the Charter, this was immediately taken up by a key territory in that of Burma. And as you can imagine, this caused much consternation for those in the Colonial Office, the India and Burma Office, and in the Cabinet itself, because perhaps rather absent-mindedly they had thought this only applied, in their words, to aggressor nations in this conception, and the very reactionary Viceroy in India, Lord Linlithgow, said that this would make the declaration would make his job infinitely more difficult to get cooperation from ministers, which is already a very difficult task already. So as you can imagine, yes, many people, especially in the Indian National Congress and in the undivided India's Muslim League, thought that this had ramifications for their categories. And though there has, I suppose, in much of the historiography, there's whether Roosevelt had made this in an absent-minded sense and not really thought of the ramifications, but there is certainly evidence of that the Americans did very much have places like India in mind, and had and though they almost seeking in some ways to embarrass Churchill and the British cabinet on this issue, and but of course people like Amery and others were anxious to quieten any ideas that this would apply to the empire. And in fact, Lord Moyne, who was then the colonial secretary, almost immediately also provided a memorandum which was sent to all the colonial governors, saying that the phrase in Article 3 about the ability to choose the form of government under which they will live was used only for nations in Europe. So he explicitly said that they had nothing to do with, of course, most of the empire was outside of Europe, and instead there was in some ways some of the tired phrases about the evolution of self-government would come when it was due, rather than giving any timetable as such. And this was discussed, and much agreement among the cabinet there. And I was happy that Pauline mentioned the Statute of Westminster, because it was something else that I wished to briefly bring up, because of course the Statute of Westminster had been passed 10 years prior to the Atlantic Charter in 1931. And this, I suppose, was the other Balfour Declaration, if you like, and this famously described that there was autonomous communities within the British Empire where they effectively had, without necessarily using the phrase, parliamentary sovereignty in their own parts. But of course, this only applied to the so-called settler dominions, and there was still a belief by people like the Dominion Secretary, who was Lord Cranborne, that this was only to apply the extension, if you like, of the Balfour Declaration and the Statute of Westminster would not be extended, despite the pressure that the Americans and the Charter itself had brought into the discussion in the colonial world. And there was, interestingly, from taking away from London, there were people like Peter Fraser in New Zealand, the New Zealand Prime Minister, the Labour New Zealand Prime Minister, was also worried about how the Atlantic Charter would be considered in the Pacific, for example, thinking of the potential for a whole change of policies and potential self-determinations and new states arising in the Asia Pacific, which Fraser was very concerned about for security reasons, because New Zealand and Australia felt exposed, not at that time to the Japanese, but to many others. And just to finish, I dug up a parliamentary question that was asked of Churchill of that time. Of course, as I'm sure has been said in earlier panels, Churchill was absolutely determined that this charter did not apply to the empire, and in fact, but interestingly, in an answer to a parliamentary question on whether Article 3 did apply to the empire, he said that this was not a statement of future colonial constitutional aims for the empire, and he said, quote, that with the Atlantic Charter we had in mind primarily the restoration of the sovereignty, self-government, and national life of the states and nations of Europe, now under the Nazi yoke, and the principles governing any alterations to the territorial boundaries which may have to be made. And then he says, this is a quite separate problem from the progressive evolution of self-governing institutions in the regions and peoples which owe allegiance to the British Crown. And interestingly, in some ways, he was forced to say at the end of the statement, against his, certainly it seems reluctantly to say at the end, said that there will be a separate high conception of freedom and justice inspired by the joint declaration, which would be said about colonial policy for the empire. And of course, this is in some ways conspicuous in its absence. I mean, there were many statements of the British government made about colonial policy during the war years, but effectively it was the usual point that this would wait until the war had been ended, rather than making a promise such as what some of the Indians had wanted, and arguably even someone like Stafford Cripps also wanted, but this was found wanting in reality. So I think I'll leave it there if that's all right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harshan, and thank you for bringing out the ways also in which the charter was contested. I mean, in which the limited interpretation of the charter was contested. I mean, this was expressed by a number of anti-colonial groups in London, but also, I mean, you mentioned Asia, also in Africa. I mean, in South Africa, which was part of the territories included in the Statute of Westminster, the ANC and some of the groups opposed to apartheid presented their own version of the Atlantic Charter, which was, of course, much broader in scope. And on this, perhaps, I'd like to bring in Henning.
Yes, thank you, Mélanie. And I can directly pick up where Harshan ended and bring in an African perspective. It fits as nicely that as if we would have exchanged notes before. So I was smiling with relief when I listened to Harshan, because I said it couldn't be more fitting, because the Atlantic Charter is one of the international normative conventions, maybe one of the first, given the constellation of 1941, which highlights, on the one hand, the power of definition when it comes to a white supremacist perspective of colonial powers, but on the other side, already also global players who pick it up and use it in a very different meaning. And Harshan already explained why that is so, especially with the third paragraph, which he quoted, and also to some extent the sixth, which reinforced it in a similar way. And I had to smile because I picked up another quote from Churchill. And when Harshan started, I was afraid, oh no, please don't. Because he also said the following: I did not become the Prime Minister of Her Majesty's government in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire in response to the demands of colonial nationalist leaders, anti-colonial leaders, that, of course, the Atlantic Charter in its paragraph 3 subscribes to sovereignty and self-determination. And as Harshan also emphasized, when it was adopted with occupied territories, the meaning was entirely Eurocentric. The World War II occupied territories in Europe. And it didn't even dawn upon them that they're speaking about their own colonial priests, because they were not considered as entities which would be entitled to national sovereignty. So it turned out almost like a weapon against those who formulated it unwillingly and unintentionally so, and made major inroads. It was very much opportune generally for African nationalists, and was taken serious by those who not been provided with an agency to articulate their voices. Now they had a powerful reference point, and it was ironically a reference point adopted by the biggest Western powers. And they said, but that's what you were putting down as normative framework. So you basically present on us on a silver platter the right to self-determination. And it was not an accident that the Pan-Africanists at the Fifth Congress in Manchester in 1945 gave huge prominence to the Atlantic Charter and called for the universal implementation of the principles of self-determination in the Charter. It was a major topical issue there. And they created a linkage between attaining governance and the liquidation of European empires, because they said that's by implication what you actually subscribed to. It's a liquidation of your European colonial empires. And in their policy objectives, they explicitly refer to the Charter, which therefore became a powerful tool against colonial perpetuation. Which was to quite some extent successful, first in Asia, but then also through the Bandung Conference, where hardly any sovereign African states were there. But after that, it triggered what Harold Macmillan then grudgingly called the winds of change in the 1950s, when numerous former colonies obtained independence, to some extent directly relating to the Atlantic Charter. And one of the contradictions, of course, which also was already pointed at by Pauline, is the definition of sovereignty versus self-determination, which played out in a special case in apartheid South Africa, which could claim already as a founding member of the League of Nations and a founding member of the United Nations, where the trusteeship council, by the way, was a direct picking up the vibes of the Atlantic Charter and provided another opportunity for colonial territories, that it was considered a sovereign state, the Union of South Africa, and then the Republic. But when you come to the notion of self-determination, of course, self-determination was obtained in 1994 with the first general democratic elections in South Africa. Until then, it was a white minority regime. So that's a very interesting aspect, of course, where, strictly speaking, the Atlantic Charter, and I was listening with huge interest when it comes to Scotland, Wales, and Ireland and those territories, that from a South African perspective, there was this inbuilt contradiction, of course, between sovereignty and self-determination, and for a series of other settler minority regimes, not least the Federation, Southern Northern Rhodesia, and related territories. Now, Mélanie also asked me to reflect on the legacies 80 years later, and we just witnessed today a signing of a new Atlantic Charter. It has, of course, different connotations, but it stresses the defending of democracy, collective security, and an open trading system. And again, who holds the power of definition over those normative values? Of course, you can interpret them in very different ways. We are living still in a world of asymmetric power relations, even if we have 190 plus independent governments represented in the United Nations system compared with the, I guess, 40 or 50 plus when the United Nations were established. But we still have the asymmetric power relations. Now, if you are serious about democracy, and translate it into a global normative framework, like re-signing an Atlantic Charter 80 years later, then what about democratization of the United Nations Security Council? If you're serious, why not provide those who are denied agency until the very day, beyond some formal representation, to have a meaningful say? There's not one single permanent member in the United Nations Security Council, or debate, do you need a United Nations Security Council with some permanent members who hold a veto right, or should it not be replaced by the General Assembly? By the way, an idea which Dag Hammarskjöld had just before he was killed in a plane accident, because he was frustrated battling with the veto powers of permanent members in the United Nations Security Council, which in his view violated against the principles of the Charter by applying it. And he was actually looking into ways, could not the General Assembly be strengthened to be empowered to take more responsibility and decisions? Of course, that would be other voices which they who signed the Atlantic Charter now don't want to see in the club. Well, then again, who holds the power of definition? What is included and what is excluded? And of course, also came to my mind a number of ongoing current cases which remain unresolved. And Peter is, of course, paying attention to the Falkland Islands, so I don't have to mention them. But I put down Chagos as another case where I think, okay, when you're serious, what is going on since the early 1960s? When it comes to that case? What about West Papua? And if I may say so, despite the contested notion it carries, what about Palestine? And what about Western Sahara? And I guess I have overlooked a number of other cases, and I'm sorry for that, but it should be sufficient to illustrate that if you're serious about certain statements, in the fundamental meaning they could have from the perspective of those who are very often overlooked or ignored, then it would have an impact which maybe those who signed today did not have on their radar screen. And that comes also to the other aspects which are listed in today's revised new Atlantic Charter: climate crisis, biodiversity, and pandemics, global pandemics. Now, if you're serious about commitment to fight those, you have to end the notion of development guided by the Anthropocene. The very same notion that those who sign have benefited from on a global scale. And I'm pretty sure that's not what they mean when they sign the new Atlantic Charter today. But that is, of course, the challenge, where one should say, okay, be serious about what you sign. What about abandoning the economy of resource exploitation on unsustainable grounds? What about returning to self-determination for those territories still occupied and denied a say? If you are serious about those global responsibilities. I think I rest my case here, but it relates, of course, to other notions we are battling with, not least in the UK, but also in other European countries and in the USA. I mentioned white supremacy. Black Lives Matter would be another example. Gender-based violence. I mean, you can go on and on and on, and we would exceed the time, of course, to list all these things. But they are not, I would believe, on the screen of those who signed the charter then. Okay, some of those issues were not a topic then, but they are not on the screen of those who signed the charter today.
Thank you very much, Henning. And as you mentioned, to look in, to carry on the conversation about, how British and UN diplomacy works in specific important case studies. Peter, of course, has been working on, the history and recent developments in the Falklands, which also brings up many of the issues that have been discussed. So, Peter, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Melanie, and it's great to be here. And hello, everyone. And thanks to Henning for sort of setting the scene a little bit for me. And just to say that I will mention the Falklands, and it does come throughout, but I'd like to also mention the situation more generally with the overseas territories as well. So sovereignty, self-determination and self-government are key themes, of course, for the British overseas territories. And I know several papers over the 2 days at the conference look at these issues in depth in regard to Gibraltar and also the British Indian Ocean territory, which is excellent. But hopefully over the next few minutes, I'll just set the scene a little bit with some of the issues at play across the territories. But it is sometimes difficult because there are 14, so there's quite a lot of nuance there as well. But in a nutshell, I would say the debate about sovereignty, self-determination and self-government is very much circumscribed at the moment. In other words, discussion and debate is narrowly drawn, and that does cause significant tensions between certain territories and the United Kingdom, because there's not much room for maneuver when it comes to governance or greater levels of self-government. Of course, one key challenge, as I said, is the analysis of the great diversity amongst the territories, and that frames any debate over their status. So we have differences in geography, we have differences in population size, ranging from about 65,000 in Bermuda to 40 or maybe just a little bit less in Pitcairn. We have the economic makeup of the territories, so the importance of certain key industries like tourism, offshore finance, fisheries, which is particularly important in the Falklands, and also the level of UK support. So the majority of territories don't have UK budgetary support, but some do, such as Montserrat, St Helena and Pitcairn, and also their foreign relations too. and the disputes over their territory. So Gibraltar, the British Indian Ocean Territory, and of course the Falkland Islands as well. So I'll try and provide a bit of a balance between general trends and issues in particular territories. Now, since the height of the decolonisation period, relations have certainly ebbed and flowed in relation to the UK and the overseas territories, including how much engagement and interest there is on the UK's part. This is an interesting case. In January 1969, the Daily Telegraph asked the Foreign Office how many territories remained. Although the paper was given the current figure, 14, it took the FCO another 2.5 hours to discover the territories' names. I'm not suggesting that's the case today, but there are examples where when the UK has disengaged, it has caused serious problems. So in the mid-1980s, for example, there were significant levels of corruption in the Turks and Caicos Islands. One commentator said that this allowed a scandalous degree of drug-related activity and corruption to flourish almost to the point of subversion. And of course, 20 years on, a similar situation in the Turks and Caicos Islands. A different one slightly was in Montserrat in the mid to late 1990s, with the eruption of the volcano, of course, the displacement of significant part of their population. Many came to the UK expecting to be welcomed and to enter the country freely, but that wasn't the case. They had no right to remain in the UK, no citizenship, as a consequence of the various immigration acts which had been implemented up to that point. And that was a great shock. They felt we are a British territory, but actually we don't have access to Britain at times of crisis. And after these incidents, the UK has attempted to re-engage. But there is always that degree of the UK being uncomfortable about being seen as a colonial power. So there's always that difficult balancing act about engaging or not engaging and how that level of engagement is perceived by others. And certainly within the Caribbean community doesn't waste much time to attack the UK if they engage, such as in the British Virgin Islands at the moment, with the inquiry over corruption, or in the Turks and Caicos Islands in the past. So in terms of the balance of power, and this is really interesting, and it goes back to Pauline's comments about where decisions are made. So of course, over the last 20 years, there's been a clear trend towards awarding greater self-government for the territories, and there are broad areas of local control for the territories. But the UK retains important red lines. So they want to maintain some power with the responsibility that they have. So in issues in areas like good governance, the end of the death penalty, the decriminalisation of gay sex, and more recently, the beneficial ownership of public registers. In those cases, the UK has intervened directly over the heads of local politicians, and this has caused significant controversy. Although again, the nuance is important. So for some of those issues, it was more of a concern to the Caribbean, certainly around the death penalty and the decriminalisation of gay sex for the Falklands. Those issues were less important. And you could also say there's a sliding scale of trust that the UK government has in relation to its overseas territories, with the Falklands and Gibraltar at the higher end of that scale. We've mentioned already the role of the United Nations, and this is very important within the context of the status and position of the overseas territories within the international system. So the particular status of the territories as they are constructed with the United Kingdom, that's not recognised by the United Nations as truly self-governing. And of course, the UN has three options to achieve this: independence, incorporation into the territory of the governing power, or free association, whereby the territory has complete freedom to decide for itself the relationship it wants with the governing power. And the UK will not agree to this. So they will not agree to any ideas around free association, because it goes back to the idea that if you have responsibility, you have to have some kind of power to enforce that and to intervene if necessary. So there are clear limits in terms of how the UK views and what the UK views as being a process of self-determination in the territories. And of course, when there are territorial disputes, there's an added layer of complexity. So the UN believes, for example, that the territorial dispute regarding the Falkland Islands has to be decided first, resolved first, before the self-determination for the islanders is considered. So in the Falklands, and I think for Gibraltar, there's an extra layer of difficulty in relation to this self-determination question. The UK, of course, is critical of the UN view, but there's no getting away from the UN role and its standing in the international system. Another question is, how can we judge the views of the populations in terms of their attitudes towards the link with the United Kingdom, and it's very difficult to tell. You could argue that by default, that through inaction there is little appetite for significant change, but maybe that's a rather complacent view to have. But there have been, I think, 5 referenda since the 1960s regarding particular territories' links with the UK, and all have reinforced the status quo. So there was one in Gibraltar in 1967, where British sovereignty was reinforced by 99.64% of the vote. Then in Anguilla, when it didn't want to become independent with St Kitts and Nevis, they broke away. They had a referendum wanting to reinforce their connections with the UK. You had Bermuda in 1995 for an independence referendum. That was unsuccessful. Then you had Gibraltar referendum in 2002, which rejected the shared sovereignty plan between the UK and Spain. And then most recently in the Falklands in 2013, again, reinforcing British sovereignty, that linked to Britain. 99.8% of those that voted in favour of retaining the link to the UK. Now, from time to time, there has been talk about independence, particularly in the Caribbean. So before the corruption in the mid-1980s, the Turks and Caicos Islands talked about independence. Prior to the volcano in Montserrat wanted to move towards independence. But really little has happened. And little has been done really by the territories or by the UK really to lay the groundwork for an informed debate and possible decision about the longer term status of the territories. Some local leaders use sort of the UK as a punch bag to criticise them at times of elections, and we'll move towards independence now, but there's never any follow through. So it's really rhetorical more than anything else. And just briefly about the present state of relations. I think generally it's a difficult period for various reasons. Brexit, of course, had a significant impact on the British overseas territories. There were trade advantages, so the Falkland Islands fisheries now have to pay tariffs to enter a significant market, the EU market. EU provided significant levels of aid for the territories. Now that's gone, and the UK government is reluctant to make good those amounts of aid that were provided. And of course, of diplomacy. So the Falklands and Gibraltar are concerned that going forward, the EU member states will be less supportive of its standing in relation to being associated with UK rather than Argentina and Spain. Around social policy, this is an area of concern. Mentioned previously about gay rights, but now the governor has enforced civil partnerships in the Cayman Islands, and this caused some controversy. There's also stronger economic interventions by the UK. So those that are considered to be economically self-sustaining, the UK want to keep to that. So Anguilla is being encouraged quite strongly to introduce a goods and services tax against its will. And of course, the corruption inquiry in the BVI. It's not all bad news. The COVID vaccination rollout has been a great success, and all of the territories are pretty much vaccinated now, free of charge. The UK government provided that support. And again, there are differential impacts in relation to some of these issues. So the Falklands, Gibraltar will always be tied to the UK. The Caribbean overseas territories have a more fractious relationship, and maybe perhaps in the next 10 to 20 years consider independence. So just finally, I go back to the issue of the circumscribed self-determination and self-government within the British overseas territories. As things stand, it's difficult to see what can change. There are the UK red lines, there are the territorial disputes, the lack of preparation for change, particularly in the Caribbean, small size and economic dependency in certain cases. And there's little give in the tectonic plates that underpin relations, and therefore limited space for territories, for tensions to be mitigated, except perhaps for a significant eruption, although for the moment I think that seems unlikely. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you again to all 4 of you. So I'd like to really open the discussion more widely, and if anyone has questions, please you can raise a virtual hand, or or signal in the chat. Also, I was going to ask before we do move on to the questions, whether any of you wanted to perhaps pick, respond or say anything more on each other's papers as well before we open it, but perhaps not. Right. One thing that struck me is that one element I think you all mentioned, really brought up in different ways, was that of normative values sort of playing out at different levels. So thinking about the way that the international system works, going back to the interplay between power and sovereignty, and ways and means of exercising influence, and so the changing, I suppose, norms that international organisations have put forward, but also, I suppose, normative values at the more local or national level, because I think that one of the points that also came out in some of your presentations, and perhaps thinking more particularly about Peter's and Pauline's, was the ways in which Britain is linked to the overseas territories or vice versa, and the ways in which the Union is held together, and what the fault lines are, and what sort of what values hold them together, but also views of the international system. So I suppose one of the questions that I was beginning to formulate, listening to your all four presentations, was whether you see either at the moment or at any points in the years that we've been discussing, a particular consensual view in British politics, or more widely in British society, as to what Britain's role in, not just Britain's role in the world, but Britain's role in building efficient international organisations, multilateral organisations should be, and whether this might in fact be one of the ways of assessing the strengths or fragilities of the Union. I don't know if any of you want to say anything on this.
Shall I start? Although Pauline has her hand up too.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So just briefly, I think interesting. The British overseas territories don't have much of a sort of a presence really in British political dialogue. So it's interesting doing some work on the Falklands about the misunderstandings of what the Falklands is all about, the ideas of the Falklands 40 years ago in the 82 war rather than the contemporary Falklands. So there was a classic case, I think, in one newspaper when they were talking about offshore finance, and they had a picture of Stanley, and of course Stanley had one bank and no interest in offshore finance. So in terms of the wide sort of ideas around what the overseas territories are, I think it's pretty low profile for the British population more generally. There is general consensus between the parties in terms of how the territory should be dealt with. And interesting about the normative values. So I guess for the territory, the normative values is about, and it links into what the UK says are contingent liabilities. So the UK is very concerned about things going wrong in the territories, financially, legally, and the British government being held to account. So that's why they imposed the end of the death penalty. They decriminalised gay sex. So there are certain standards associated with the United Kingdom, which they feel should be implemented and necessarily imposed in the territories, even though they have locally a different cultural perspective. So I think that's very important, really, in terms of looking at the value systems. You could say, from what I've said now in my presentation, why do the territories wish to stay linked to the UK, despite all this sort of tension? And I think they feel that despite everything, the UK does provide a useful level of additional oversight, and they can intervene. So the politicians might have one view, but the local population might have quite a different one, despite the tension. So I think that's very important. But it is a real issue there in terms of the value system and the UK imposing or implementing things which it thinks should be in the territories, even though in reality it's quite different from, if you look at the wider Caribbean, the idea of decriminalising gay sex is very far away, but in the territories that's the case. So there is some interesting sort of tensions and nuances there around the values question.
I would say the issue is very different in the case of the UK, in the case of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but there is very much an issue about what holds them all together, and this is reflected in the very challenging, the challenge that defining a common Britishness has become. Something that used to be taken for granted, that all these nations shared a lot and shared a British identity, is much more problematic now, apparently. I was turning towards this really very good book on English that has come out lately, which gives a very interesting and nuanced understanding of how this plays out. But basically, the attempts that were made in the last few decades to define a common identity to the different nations has proved very hollow and difficult, because once you've said that the nations share common values such as freedom and well, freedom of expression and democracy, and well, that is not, hopefully not just in the UK, that you have these values, and therefore this is not really enough to define a common identity. Then you have institutions which are often mentioned as the common glue, the monarchy, the NHS, so a sort of common social policy, if I may say. But is that enough to keep these nations together? This is really becoming a big issue in the contemporary British debate, and no one has really found a very powerful solution to this, and certainly not the present Conservative government, except by sending money out to these nations. But is that enough to keep the country together? I'm not sure.
Henning or Harshan, I don't know if you want to come in on any of these points.
I could add an outsider's perspective because I'm the odd one out. I don't know the UK from the inside. And what strikes me is what I'm witnessing now in the aftermath of signing the Brexit deal. And you might now say, no, not again. But unfortunately, it does relate to what we discuss. And I just listened attentively yesterday evening to an interview at BBC World with Mary Robinson, who stressed the point that if you sign international agreements, you ought to be held liable. So the one side is if you impose on dependent territories what you think is correct, but then you sign up for international treaties, then you have to live up to what you sign. So how do you can claim the moral high grounds or even the legal high grounds at a time where you are basically eroding the trust in your own reliability in a global system? And I think that relates, at least indirectly, of course, to the issues discussed around the Atlantic Charter as a normative framework. if we live in a regulated world based on the Westphalian state principle and agreements which are entered between governments representing states, I'm reluctant to say representing people because most of the states do not represent the majority of the people. But if you are in that system, then this sets out rules of the game. And then even if you feel you have the power of definition, if you are in violation of these rules of the game, you risk your own reputation and being taken serious in the future. And Mary Robinson was very careful, very diplomatic as an elder statesman, or rather stateswoman, but it was very clear that she had absolutely no justification for the current British way of wrangling out of legal obligations entered. And there might be a similar experience facing when it comes to what we witnessed 80 years ago, signing up to an Atlantic Charter. And then afterwards, like Churchill said, but that doesn't mean this and that. And others said, no, it does mean exactly that. So.
If I may, I'll just quickly say I really enjoyed Henning's description of the power of definition, which I think is so apt, and it reminded me of a quote which may have some application to what we're describing. So one of the people I work on is a person called Sir Ivor Jennings, who was a great constitutional scholar during the period of decolonization and in Britain. He said that for the British, one of their things about constitutional design and understandings was a refusal to define. And so maybe that applies both to Atlantic charters and to issues in Northern Ireland and with Europe, which is of course continental Europe, which has a different, more, if you like, Roman understanding of law and constitutions, as opposed to the, if you like, the studied ambiguity comes with the traditional British constitutional setup, and that's clearly in evidence in the Atlantic Charter, because if Churchill had absolutely understood to the letter that this meant the potential, as Henning brought up, to be the King's first minister, to liquidate the British Empire, there was no way that would have been signed whatsoever. But in keeping to that tradition, he thought it could mean one thing, and it can be evaded, avoided, and ignored, which is what he effectively did when it came to the empire.
Thank you very much, Harshan. And it's interesting that you should mention Sir Ivor Jennings, because in fact he was mentioned also earlier on by Stuart Ward, who's now had to leave, but is giving the lecture tomorrow. And he really emphasised the importance of his writings well into the 50s. So it's interesting to see these important figures in British policy making and, you know, circles keeping reappearing. Really, are there any questions from anyone? Yes, I've missed a hand. Manu? I think you're still muted.
Okay. You hear me now?
Yeah.
I think my question goes to Henning and Harshan. It's really a confusion, or something I like to understand, because I'm not sure how much, or how can we consider international law to be law in the case of self-determination, for example, when I think the origin of that phrase perhaps was during the not the Second World War, mainly to be used to dismantle the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And if you think about the way the Africans used it after the Second World War to dismantle the European empires, but immediately after that, they outlawed a self-determination that is not European. Let's say if you're a group in Africa and you want to exercise the right of self-determination, you have to have been a group occupied by a European empire, according to the OAU treaty. So if it's something that you instrumentalize when you need it, and then immediately backpedal, like you said Churchill did, and the way the early African leaders did, we have, I'm currently researching secessionism in Cameroon and Nigeria, where the states are basically saying to the English speakers in Cameroon, no, you don't have a right to self-determination. Nigeria is saying to the Igbo people in the East, you don't have a right to self-determination. So how much of law is the right to self-determination? Or is it just something that you use when you need it? Sorry if I've gone too long.
Yes, Henning.
I'm often tempted to quote Lord Acton, who says power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And of course, the reference to decolonization is made by those who are the leaders of anti-colonial movements. But the moment their struggle, their nationalist struggle is successful, they actually execute a very similar concept of power as the one they were fighting against. Ashish Nandy wrote a brilliant book on India when it comes to that, and the title says it all. He called it The Intimate Enemy, meaning you do reproduce a mindset against which you are fighting. So once you replace those in power, you apply very similar discourses, perspectives, and tools to stay in power. And Biafra is of course a very obvious case. Cameroon is an obvious case. Pragmatically, the OAU decided that the colonial boundaries have to be respected, which they did not 100% then themselves recognize, but let's say 95%. And that was speaking to those who were now holding the political power. And again, the power of definition. So, of course, decolonization did not truly decolonize mindsets or power relations. So we are still perpetuating asymmetric power relations, and they are on shifting grounds, but within societies, they are not overcome or abandoned. They are used again against the demands of other people if it comes handy. That's unfortunately a dilemma I'm battling with in Southern Africa. I've been a member since 1974 of SWAPO as the anti-colonial movement. And I left Namibia out of frustration of what I called the limits to liberation. But would that mean we didn't want to obtain independence because we entered a pact among elites? Of course not. It was a step in the right direction, only that it was not rigorously and consequently enough implemented. We reproduced the old system in the emperor's new clothes, you could say, but it was still, post-apartheid South Africa is still better than apartheid society, at least for 95% of the people living there, despite the fact that they are still battling for true emancipation.
Just building on Henning's point, and thank you for the question. It's interesting, as Henning says, but the post-colonial continuities of these sorts of things, especially in law, actually, because if I'm not an expert of the Cameroon or Nigeria, but if I look at one of the most emblematic post-colonial cases of India, 2/3 of, say, the Government of India Act, which was the longest piece of legislation ever passed by the British Parliament, and effectively gave a constitution to India, had no Indian involvement whatsoever. And yet, when India framed its own constitution after independence, 2/3 of that document ended up in the 1950 Constitution, and much of it, which I think this is building on Henning's point, was about emergency laws, which had been used against political opponents during the colonial period. Now it was used in this case by Sardar Patel and people around Nehru against political opponents, and was meant to be a dormant power, but it has been used right up until the minute with people like Modi using it against, for example, in Kashmir and other opposition states. So this is a phenomena across the post-colonial world where, consciously or not, because now it's been multiple generations, of course, since independence. But the colonial example has been built upon and sometimes extended.
Thank you. Pauline or Peter, I know the question wasn't directly to you, I think, but I don't know if you wanted to come in on this, either of you.
Melanie, it's probably not relevant, but it's interesting in the Caribbean perspective, the level of intervention by both the United States and the United Kingdom just prior to self-determination being achieved. So the example of Guyana, for example, with Chile Jagan. So the deep levels of intervention, making sure that when self-determination was finally achieved, when independence was finally achieved, certain influences within society would be marginalized as much as possible. So I guess it's maybe the flip side of what's been discussed previously, but that's an interesting element to maybe some of this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do we have anyone else wanting to ask a question? Yes, Philip.
It's really it's a question for Harshan, really, and just I suppose which is, when did Australia become sovereign and independent? And as you know how my mind is working, that actually the ironic thing, it was fascinating to hear Pauline talking about the extent to which debates in Britain have become hung up with an absolutist interpretation of sovereignty. That for much of its imperial history, the British did their best to kind of fudge what sovereignty represented, which created all sorts of problems. I mean, we had a very interesting conference a couple of weeks ago about Cyprus and Cyprus joining the Commonwealth. And of course, there was a debate in 1960-61 about whether Cyprus was even eligible to join the Commonwealth, because there was a question about whether it was properly sovereign and independent because of the agreements with Greece and Turkey, which effectively limited its sovereignty. So back to Harshan, when did Australia become sovereign and independent?
I won't miss an opportunity to say something bad about Australia. So it would be happy to do so. But yes, it's a very good question, I suppose. Well, I mean, it's a common thing in Australasian historiography about, you know, when did the flag come down, if it ever did, and I mean, there are two potential years or dates that could be thought of. I mean, the 1942 is sometimes seen as the year because that's when Australia ratified the Statute of Westminster, which is, as you know, is 11 years after that was possible. So places like Ireland, South Africa did it immediately in 1931, but Australia and New Zealand and Newfoundland, for example, refused actually to ratify it because they did not want, they saw it as being disloyal to Britain. And then, as you know, Philip, then there's also, of course, the stuff around the Australia Acts, 1986, 88, just before the bicentenary, about whether about where Britain still had, until that point, residual powers, which was occasionally exercised in the states of Australia, not at the federal level. And then there are those, arguable reasons would say that by keeping the resident at Buckingham Palace as head of state, even though, of course, formally she's the Queen of Australia, as opposed to being in Australia constitutionally Queen of Great Britain. But of course, she is still in Buckingham Palace. So arguably for some, this is an infringement on Australian sovereignty. But just to a final thing to add, I suppose these are all Australian decisions. These are none that are imposed by Britain. These are Australia, at times of its history, it's wanted to be exactly that, unindependent, if you like, and at other times it's wanted to be very independent, and then found that the constitution they framed doesn't allow them to do it. Probably doesn't answer what you wanted, Philip. But...
No, that's a good answer.
or could we say they wanted the substance of independence without having the form or the appearance of it?
Apologies. Does anybody else have a question or comment? We've got a few minutes left if you want. If not, then I'd like to briefly, perhaps more as a in the final parts of this roundtable, to return to what Philip mentioned this morning, which is the Johnson and Biden meeting and relationship, and talks of a new Atlantic Charter. And it's also something that Henning mentioned earlier on, giving a number of pointers as to what, in fact, 80 years on, a new Atlantic Charter should look like and should include. And so I suppose I was wondering where each of you, where do you see where do you see Britain's main contribution to be, if there was to be a sort of new Atlantic Charter, or bearing in mind Henning's earlier comment about his position being more of an outsider, do you see Britain coming very much into the picture of an ambitious international charter that could be drafted, and linked to all of this, because this is something that perhaps rather surprisingly, in a way, we've not discussed in a lot of detail. Where do you see Anglo-American relations playing out in all of this? Either from a historical perspective, or in the current sort of power dynamics, and in the current returning to this idea of definition of attempts to define what the international system should be. I don't know if yes, Henning.
Just spontaneous remarks or comments. I'm getting second thoughts. What's the purpose of signing 80 years later another Atlantic Charter, when you have two powers who are actually on the way of being phased out as being the dominant players in the global system? Is it wishful thinking? Is it a desperate attempt to restore some global credibility, which allows them punching above their weight or maybe regaining the weight. I think a second Atlantic Charter is slightly out of touch with the global system of our world in 2021. Shouldn't it be a global charter, ocean charter then to remain in the picture instead of an Atlantic charter? They continue to claim the power of definition by highlighting what from their perspective are the issues. But that sets out an agenda of two Western powers. And for me, it will be interesting to see how it plays out on the issue of Northern Ireland the next few days, with Biden talking to Johnson, because I don't think they share everything at the moment. There might be some tough choices to be made from the White House administration when it comes to partnering with the EU or with Great Britain. It's speculative, but I think signing another Atlantic Charter 80 years later is a little bit of wishful thinking of two dinosaurs, if I may say it in that disrespectful way.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for your comments. There is actually another question in the chat, and then Alicia's got her hand up. Shall I take the questions, but do signal to me if you want to add things. Chandra, do you want to ask your question directly? So the question in the chat was, how did these debates get reflected in the formation of the modern Commonwealth? If Harshan, you want to say a few words on this, for example?
Sure. Well, I would say it's negligible, to be frank. I think it had, I mean, it certainly contributed to more discussion and welcome attention for those under colonial rule, to see that this could at least speak to their objectives. But in terms of actual concrete changes for those states, territories under colonial rule, I think it did not mean much. And I don't think my personal view is that I don't think the foundation of the modern Commonwealth, which usually is seen as about around 1949, had anything really to do with the Atlantic Charter. Probably more San Francisco may have had more influence in it, and linking mainly because that there was more participation of other territories in that discussion, including territories under colonial rule. So that I think that had more of a bearing on the modern Commonwealth. And if I can be even more disrespectful, even more than Henning, I think the idea of listening to America and Britain give another charter is frankly ludicrous. And the time of listening to them, I think, is gone. So I think it would have cosmetic for a certain internal audience for them, but it won't be heard very greatly overseas, in my view.
Thank you. Alicia?
Thank you. I would just like to say that this is a fascinating conference and I'm really enjoying it, so thank you very much. This was just a minor point about the charter, the second charter. Could it be, sorry. Apologies. Could it be perhaps a question of timing? And reparation after the Trump years. The withdrawal of Trump worldwide created a massive power vacuum. Perhaps Biden is reinstating his a claim to acting in the world and to maintaining a stronger relationship and to reaffirming democracy. And although this may be a symbolic gesture, I think it says a lot about Biden's future policy. Now we're going to have to see how this works out. But I think it's not uninteresting.
Philip, did you want to? Oh, no, I thought you were going to say something, sorry.
Well, no, I mean, I think that Henning wanted to come in, so I'll just let Henning, yeah.
I just want to share something which Mary Robinson in the interview yesterday said on a similar question. She reminded the audience, which was listening at BBC World, that you have to put your money where your mouth is. And she said, if you return to the Paris Agreement and then you double up the payments, you are still short of actually you should have quadrupled the payments. So you try to come away cheap. And I think it's similar with symbolic gestures like the Atlantic Charter. It doesn't really cost you anything to sign a charter. What impacts more is that you really live up to things instead of paying lip service. And the US administration might repeatedly say we are back as a global player to be responsible. It will be measured against what it is doing. And I think that is the bottom line.
And I mean, sorry, just following up on that, I suppose that the puzzling thing, I mean, isn't that Johnson should want to do this, because we know how obsessed the Brits are about the Second World War, and it's become this sort of great, you know, defining national mythology. But why the Americans should want to play this game? And I think it's very interesting that the people briefing the press today from the American side have been stressing that this is about democracies uniting together. So in a sense, Biden is clearly trying to define a basis for a more proactive American foreign policy. And I suppose that's the sort of code for the West versus China, but framing it in terms of perhaps a more idealistic moment of 1941.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm aware that we've gone beyond 5:30, and I think that several of you have other commitments in calling. So I'd really like to thank again all four speakers for what has been I thought a really stimulating discussion. And as I think we'd hoped, it's really as well served as a brilliant transition between the panels that we had today and what we've got coming up tomorrow, including Stuart's keynote